I'm Juliet Strange and I will be your storyteller today. Act 1. The night was freezing and devoid of starlight as Millicent Parks made her way up onto the deck. The ship pitched and tossed upon the ocean, flinging the drenched crewmen on deck from side to side. The rigging sang as it beat against the sails and the sea roared beneath them all. The coxswain held onto the helm as tight as he could, keeping steady the giant wheel. But Coxswain Bennett would not be losing his hold of the wheel, a salty old sea dog for nearing 30 years. His grip was as tight as if it had been made of barnacles, and his determination just so. He spotted Millicent through the rain, leaning against the wind at the stern, making her way towards him. He wondered what on earth any human being would be doing adeck on a howling night like this. Bennett sunk further into his woolen jacket and turned his gaze from the foolish female to the night sky. He couldn't see far, the mist descending, the moon invisible anyway, and no friendly light to be seen. Millicent wished she had brought a lantern, but watching her swing from the ceiling in her cabin was making her ill. She decided to try and get some fresh air away from the oil lamps, putrid cargo, and the smell of sweaty men downstairs. She was the only woman on the ship, and knew most regarded her as a misfortune, or a harbinger of some sort of doom akin to Medusa or Lady Macbeth. She wished the crew no ill will at all, and was simply making a journey across the Atlantic, from Dublin to New York. Alone as she was, she certainly raised suspicions, but remained quiet enough for everyone to pay her little attention, apart from occasional scowls. Her dress was getting heavy with the rainwater, but she was finding it refreshing and even invigorating. As she made her way to the starboard rail, she pulled her knitted shawl tighter around her. Distracted, she tripped and discovered she had accidentally stepped on Edmund Tremble, a fellow passenger, who was seemingly fast asleep on the deck. Millicent marvelled at the sopping man for a moment, before catching a whiff on the wind of his scent, which was strongly of whiskey and cigars. Tremble was oblivious to the weather, but a foot had roused him slightly, and he turned and groaned in his stupor. He squinted his eyes and spotted the young woman, only 21 years old, and then moaned and held his head. "Are you going to be sick?" asked Millicent politely. Tremble couldn't hear her above the wind and shook his head in annoyance. "I asked, are you going to be sick? Can I get you some water?" Millicent shouted. Tremble declined with a wave of his hand. He pulled himself up and steadied himself. A tall, thin man, his long, slender fingers fumbled for his pocket watch. It was 5 minutes to midnight. He hastily put it away from the furious raindrops and pulled out a filthy handkerchief to wipe his face. He was wishing the money in his pockets could have extended to a ticket on a modern, fancy passenger ship instead of a cargo ship like this one. He thought for a moment of the soft beds that would await him there instead of his rotten hammock. The pale-faced girl continued to regard him, without word. Her hair had become uncoiled thanks to the downpour, and he was sure he could hear her quietly sniffing. Suddenly the storm shrieked, a strange, unearthly yowl like a banshee. At the stern the helm started spinning and wrenched out of Bennett's hands. He tried to strain against it, pulling with all his might against the unnatural force, but as the wheel spun and spun against him, he stood back, more out of amazement than exhaustion, and stared. He had never seen the like before, and braced himself for the ship to start to turn in the water. But instead the ship continued straight, bobbing up and down on the rough water, but without changing direction. The yowl began again, and on deck Tremble sank with his hands over his ears. Millicent looked about her, above and below, to see what kind of creature could be making such a racket. She didn't believe it could possibly be the sea. The rain and mist still swirled around the ship, and she couldn't see far. She could make out the figure of Bennett on the stern, standing still with his hands flat by his sides. She stared more intently, uncomprehending as to why the man would stand like that. Tremble cowered on the deck and then beheld Millicent in her motionless gaze with one hand up to her eyes. He felt shame that he was so inactive and moved to stand, heaving himself against the rail. He wasn't sure if the spinning in his head was the gale or the 3, or was it 4, bottles of whiskey he had drunk during the day. As Millicent turned to him, a sudden jolt sent both of them flying sideways across the deck. They hit the planks hard and slid across like quoits down to the stern. Bennett lurched over backwards and hit his head on the capstan. Millicent braced herself, expecting a wave to shower them any moment, but none came, and she slowly raised herself, glancing at the port side where the blow had come from. The ship was steadying against the ocean, as if it was mysteriously calming, the torrents easing. Millicent got up and ran over to the port rail where she beheld the water spinning itself into a great whirlpool. She blinked and gasped, clutching onto the familiar wood for comfort as she regarded the churning of the water and felt the spray against her face. Tremble scrambled over beside her, skidding on the slippery deck, and gripped hold of the rail with both hands. His red eyes widened and he exclaimed, "What the devil is that?" Millicent was speechless, and had no answer for him anyway. She simply continued to stare into the surging circle, watching its waves fold around each other until she realized that a rumble was beginning below the ship, and she saw a dark, huge shape emerging from the eye of the whirlpool. She held her breath as she observed the ocean, not at all comprehending the sight that was before her.